Which race in the Elder Scrolls is actually the most powerful? This is one of those questions that gets people into heated debates. Some swear by the High Elves because of their mastery of magic. Others claim the Norse because they can shout reality into submission. But when you really dig deep into the lore, when you look at what these races have actually accomplished throughout history, the answer becomes way more complex and interesting than you'd think. We're going to go through every major race in Tamriel. The 10 you can play, plus a few others that either went extinct or are too dangerous to let players control. And by the end of this video, we will know what the most powerful race was. Let's start with the Altmer, or the High Elves. The Altmer are the magical elite of Tamriel. They live on the Somerset Isles, which they only recently renamed to Alinor to match their capital city. When you meet an Altmer in any game, you immediately notice they have boosted magicka and spell effectiveness. That's because being magically gifted is literally part of their biology. They're tall, they have golden skin, and they can live for hundreds of years. Some Altmer reach 300 years old or more, which gives them centuries to perfect their craft. But the Altmer aren't just naturally talented with magic. They've built an entire civilization around it that's lasted thousands of years. Their architecture is breathtaking. Human traders who visit Alinor describe the city as looking like it's made from glass or insect wings. Imperial diplomats from the Riemann dynasty wrote that the city is a hypnotic swirl of ramparts and impossibly high towers designed to catch sunlight and break it into its component colors, draping those colors across the stones. The Altmer came from the Aldmer, the original elves who landed on Tamriel back in the Merethic era. They believe they're the closest to what those original elves were like, and they take that ancestry extremely seriously. Their society is structured around maintaining what they see as the purity of their bloodline. This makes them come across as arrogant to other races, and yeah, they kind of are. They genuinely believe elves should rule over everyone else. Their greatest monument was the Crystal Tower, also called Crystal Lake Law. This wasn't just a building. It was one of the 8 mythical focal points that helped anchor the mortal world to reality. The Aldmer built it as a memorial to the spirit of the elven people shortly after they arrived. Inside the tower were the graves of the earliest Aldmer settlers, preserved forever. The tower also housed a massive library with ancient texts, tapestries, relics like Topol the Pilot's original maps, and even a menagerie of dangerous creatures tended by trolls. The Crystal Tower was more than symbolic. It existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and its magical capabilities transcended normal physics. Before the Arcane University was built in Cyrodiil, the Crystal Tower was the pinnacle of magical learning in all of Tamriel. You could supposedly see the southern tips of the Dragon's Teeth Mountains on the mainland from the top of the tower, even though that should be impossible given the distance. The Altmer's isolation kept them out of most mainland conflicts for thousands of years. While empires rose and fell, while humans and elves fought wars across Tamriel, the Somerset Isles remained largely untouched. They had internal conflicts between their city-states, sure. Skywatch and Firsthold fought wars. Alinor and Lilendril had their disputes, but the real threats came from outside. The Slode from Thras and the Mormor from Piandonea repeatedly tried to invade the Isles. During the late Third Era, things started changing. Younger Altmer began questioning their society's xenophobia and rigid hierarchy. Some of this was constructive, like when they accepted Morgia, a Dunmer, as Queen of Firsthold. Her children with her Altmer husband are fully Dunmer in appearance, but stand to inherit the throne. That's huge for a society that prided itself on purity. But there was a darker side. A group called the Beautiful started as an artist salon with the philosophy that Somerset needed to let go of its past to move forward. They became revolutionaries, dedicated to destroying the greatest monuments of Altmer civilization. The Crystal Tower was an early target, but their attempts failed. They did manage to vandalize many ancient sculptures and emblems. Eventually, they assassinated the Princess of Shimmerine, which horrified the public. Then came the Oblivion Crisis. When Mehrunes Dagon opened his gates across Tamriel, the Somerset Isles were hit hard. Refugees from all across the islands poured into the Crystal Tower, believing it was impenetrable. But when the Daedric armies arrived, they brought Altmer prisoners to the outside of the tower. The refugees woke up to screams as the Daedra carved and ate the prisoners alive in full view. The Altmer wizards fought back with powerful fire magic. Their warriors charged with everything they had, but it wasn't enough. The Daedra built siege machines and literally tore the Crystal Tower apart. In those final moments, the hordes of Daedra vanished completely when Martin Septim sacrificed himself to end the crisis. Many Altmer survivors later had their reputations destroyed by an organization called the Talmor, who took credit for ending the invasion. Those who protested were exiled or assassinated. A hero named Rinendor the Bold, who commanded the defense of the Crystal Tower, was quickly murdered aboard a ship bound for Anvil. The Talmor used the chaos after the Oblivion Crisis to seize power. They overthrew the old Altmer monarchy and formed the Third Aldmeri Dominion. They renamed the province from Somerset Isles to Alinor. By the time of Skyrim, they forced the Empire into a treaty that banned Talos worship, which is a massive insult to the Nords. So, the Altmer are politically powerful, magically gifted, and they've built a civilization that's lasted since the dawn of recorded history. They lost the Crystal Tower, which was a devastating blow, both symbolically and practically. But they reorganized and became strong enough to challenge the Empire itself. They're a force to be reckoned with. Are they the most powerful race though? Let's keep going. The Nords are the humans of Skyrim. Big, tough, blonde warriors who value honor and strength above almost everything else. They're naturally resistant to cold, which makes sense when you live in a frozen wasteland where the weather is actively trying to kill you half the year. What makes the North special is the Tuum, the voice. This is dragon language weaponized into reality warping power. When you shout in the dragon tongue, you're not casting a spell in the traditional sense. You are speaking in the language of creation itself. You're imposing your will directly onto the world. A shout isn't magic. It's more like you're stating a fact so powerfully that reality has no choice but to agree with you. The ancient Nords learned the Tuum from Paarthurnax during the Dragon War. This was back when dragons ruled over humanity as tyrant gods. Paarthurnax, who was one of Alduin's lieutenants, betrayed the dragons and taught humans how to shout. This allowed the ancient Nords to fight back. They couldn't match the dragons in raw power, but with the voice they could at least hurt them. Eventually, they won the war and established themselves as the dominant force in Skyrim. But here's the catch. Most Nords can't actually use the Tuum. It takes decades of training and meditation to learn even one shout. The Greybeards spend their entire lives mastering it. They've become so powerful that they have to be careful speaking normally or their voices will cause destruction. When they formally greeted Ulfric Stormcloak, the sound shook the entire mountain. When they summoned the Dragonborn, their call was heard across all of Skyrim. Ulfric trained with the Greybeards for years, and he only knows a few shouts. He used unrelenting force to kill High King Torg by literally shouting him apart, which is what started the Civil War. But even Ulfric, who's one of the few Nords who can shout, is nowhere near the level of the ancient tongues who could level buildings with their voices. The real Nordic power comes from the Dragonborn. These are people blessed by Akatosh with the soul of a dragon. They can absorb dragon souls and instantly learn shouts that would take a normal person decades to master. Miraak was Dragonborn, and he became so powerful that Hermaeus Mora had to trap him in Apocrypha for thousands of years. Tiber Septim was Dragonborn. He used the Thu'um in his conquests, became emperor, and eventually achieved godhood through Kim or mantling, or some combination of both. The last Dragonborn defeated Alduin, the World Eater, which is literally the dragon that's supposed to end the world. So, the Nords have produced some of the most powerful individuals in history through the Dragonborn. The Thu'um is legitimately reality-breaking when used by someone with dragon blood. But as a race, without that divine blessing, they're really just exceptional warriors. They're tough, they can take a beating, and they know how to fight. But they're not doing anything that puts them leagues above other warrior cultures. The Tu'um is powerful, but it's rare. It's not something most Nords can access. So while individual Nords with the right blessing can be incredibly powerful, the race as a whole doesn't have that same level of power. The Dunmer live in Morrowind, and they're known for being balanced. They're decent with magic, decent with weapons, and they're tough enough to survive in a hostile volcanic environment. Their skin is dark gray, their eyes are red, and they have a complicated relationship with both the Daedra and the Tribunal. The Dunmer used to be called Chimer, which means changed folk. They were Aldmer, who followed a prophet named Veloth into Morrowind to worship the Daedra instead of the traditional elven gods. They built a civilization in the volcanic ashlands, and for a long time they prospered. Then came the Battle of Red Mountain, and everything changed. The Dwemer and the Chimer were at war. The Chimer were led by Indoril Nerevar and his council, which included Vivec, Almalexia, and Sota Sil. During the battle, the Dwemer disappeared completely, for reasons we'll get into later, but Nerevar's council did something that changed the Chimer forever. They found Kagranak's tools, the instruments designed to tap into the heart of Lorkhan. The heart of Lorkhan is the actual, physical heart of a dead god. These tools let you manipulate divine power. The council used them to achieve godhood. They became the Tribunal, living gods with incredible power and immortality. But there was a price. Azura, one of the Daedric princes the Chimer had worshipped, cursed the entire race for their betrayal. Every Chimer's golden skin turned dark gray. Their eyes became red. They became the Dunmer, forever marked by the sin of their gods. The Tribunal ruled Morrowind for thousands of years. They had power that dwarfed mortal mages. Vivec could freeze people in time, reshape landscapes, and flood entire regions. He wrote 36 sermons that were part scripture, part philosophy, and part hidden instructions for achieving divinity. Almalexia commanded armies and could kill Daedra with ease. Sota Sil built a clockwork city in a pocket dimension where he tried to improve on the very concept of reality. But their power was borrowed. They had to return to the heart of Lorkhan every year to recharge their divinity. They weren't truly gods. They were mortals running on stolen divine power. And when they lost access to the heart during the events of Morrowind, everything fell apart. Almalexia went insane from losing her power and was killed by the Nerevarine. Sota Sil was found murdered in his clockwork city. Vivec disappeared, and without his power to hold it back, the Ministry of Truth crashed into Vivid City, triggering the eruption of Red Mountain. The Red Year devastated Morrowind. Vvardenfell was almost completely destroyed. Millions died. The Dunmer lost their homeland and their gods in a single catastrophic event. Many fled to Skyrim and other provinces, where they faced discrimination and poverty. So, the Dunmer produced gods, but those gods were operating on stolen power that didn't last. The Tribunal had real divinity for thousands of years, which is impressive. But ultimately, they fell. And when they fell, they took Morrowind with them. The Dunmer, as a race, are survivors. They're tough and adaptable, but they haven't shown the kind of power that puts them at the top. The Imperials are the humans from Cyrodiil, the heartland of Tamriel. They're not the best fighters, they're not the best mages, they're not the toughest or the most naturally gifted at anything. But they are the best at bringing people together and building institutions that last. The Imperial race is a blend of the Nedic peoples who originally inhabited Cyrodiil and cultural influences from all over Tamriel. They're merchants, diplomats, soldiers, and bureaucrats. They value education, law, and order. Their cities are well organized, their roads are maintained, and their legion is disciplined and effective. The empire that dominates most of Tamriel's history is an imperial creation. They didn't conquer the continent through overwhelming force or superior magic. They did it through strategy, diplomacy, and organization. They built roads that connected every corner of the continent. They established trade routes that made everyone richer. They created a common currency that simplified commerce. They built a legal system that brought stability. Tiber Septim, who founded the Third Empire, was from Alcair in High Rock, but he exemplified imperial values. He was a brilliant strategist who knew when to fight and when to negotiate. He conquered Tamriel not just with armies, but with alliances and treaties. When he did use force, like when he wielded Numidium against the Somerset Isles, it was decisive and overwhelming. The empire lasted for thousands of years across multiple dynasties. The Alessian Empire, the Riemann Empire, the Septim Empire, each had its problems and eventually fell, but each also brought periods of relative peace and prosperity to Tamriel. That's the imperial gift. They can take dozens of different races and cultures and make them work together. But in terms of pure power, the Imperials don't really stand out. They didn't build reality warping machines like the Dwemer. They don't have the magical gifts of the Altmer or the physical dominance of the Nords. They're good at what they do, but what they do is organize and manage, not push the boundaries of what's possible. The Imperials are important to the history of Tamriel. They've shaped the political landscape more than any other race. But this is about power, and the Imperials just don't have the kind of raw power or reality-breaking achievements that other races can claim. The Bretons are from High Rock, and they're basically what happens when elves and humans have children together for generations. Way back in the First Era, the Dyreni elves ruled over the human populations of High Rock. They interbred with their human subjects, and over time this created the Breton race. They're humans with elven blood, which gives them a natural affinity for magic while still having human ambition and adaptability. Bretons are actually really good mages. They have built-in magic resistance that comes from their elven ancestry. They're known for producing excellent battle mages, spell swords, and pure casters. Some of the most powerful mages in history have been Bretons. They can match Altmer in magical ability while being more physically capable. High Rock itself is divided into dozens of small kingdoms and city-states. The Bretons are always fighting each other for power and territory. They have a feudal system with nobles, knights, and complicated political alliances. This constant infighting has made them skilled at intrigue and politics, but it's also kept them from ever unifying into a single powerful nation. The Bretons have influenced Tamriel's magical traditions significantly. Their battle mage techniques spread throughout the empire. Their enchanters are highly sought after. They've produced powerful individuals who've made their mark on history. But here's the thing. Bretons are kind of caught between two worlds. They're not as magically powerful as pure elves, because their elven blood has been diluted over generations. They're not as numerous or martially dominant as other human races. They're really good at what they do, but they haven't done anything on the scale of what we're about to talk about. They're a strong race, especially if you want to be a mage who can also hold their own in melee combat. But they haven't reshaped reality, conquered continents, or achieved anything that puts them above the other races we're discussing. Now this is where things get interesting. The Redguards came from a continent called Yokuda, which was west of Tamriel across the Eltiric Ocean. And Yokuda doesn't exist anymore because it literally sank into the sea. The Redguards are known as the best warriors in Tamriel. Not the strongest, not the toughest, but the most skilled with a blade. Every game gives them bonuses to weapon skills because it's baked into their culture. They're naturally athletic, resistant to poison, and they move fast. But more than that, they have a warrior tradition that goes back thousands of years to ancient Yokuda. On Yokuda, the Redguards were originally artisans, poets, and scholars, but constant civil wars forced them to evolve. They developed something called the Way of the Sword, a martial philosophy about blade mastery. This became sword singing. Sword singers were warriors so skilled that their swords literally sang through the air, through flesh and bone, ringing against armor. It became an answer to their prayers. The greatest sword singers were called Ansei, the sword saints. These weren't just masters of technique. They could manifest something called a Shihai, a spirit sword from their very soul. By pure force of will, an Ansei could create this ethereal blade and it would take shape in their hand. Disarming an Ansei could only be done by severing their head or taking their mind, because the blade came from within them. The most accomplished sword singer in history was Frandar Hunding. His writings, especially his Book of Circles, were revered by Redguards for centuries after his death. Hunding lived during a time when Emperor Hira tried to exterminate the sword singers. The singers were few in number and couldn't form a proper army, but Hunding led them in rebellion. The War of the Singers ended at the foot of Hatu Mountain, where Hunding's forces crushed the emperor's army. Less than 20,000 sword singers survived. They were no longer welcome in Yokuda, so Hunding and his army left, beginning the Great Migration to Hammerfell. But here's where the Red Guards become absolutely terrifying. The Ansei didn't just have spirit swords. The most powerful among them had mastered something called the Pankratos sword, a sword technique that could cut the atomos, the fundamental building blocks of reality itself. They could sever the laws of nature. According to legend and some in-game sources, this technique is what sank Yokuda. The Celestial Warrior in Elder Scrolls Online claims that the Shihai of a first-rank Ansei is what destroyed their continent. Rada al-Saran, a vampire lord who was once a legendary sword singer, claimed he could perform the same cut that sundered Yokuda. This wasn't just skill with a blade. This was reality manipulation through swordsmanship. They could cut atoms, destroy continents, and break the fundamental laws of physics by swinging a sword really, really well. After Yokuda sank, waves of refugees called the Ragada, the warrior wave, sailed to Hammerfell. They conquered the entire province from the Nedas and the elves who lived there. They established a new homeland and brought their traditions with them. For a while, the sword singers and the Ansei continued in Hammerfell. But something happened. By the mid-second era, there were no records of any Ansei left. By the third era, even the Ansei themselves were thought to have never existed. The Red Guards still had their training schools, they still honored the old ways, but the actual ability to manifest a Shihai was gone. The art was lost. So the Red Guards, at their peak, back in Yokuda, could cut atoms and sink continents. That's absolutely insane power. But by the time the games take place, they're just really, really good warriors. They're elite fighters, the best blade masters in Tamriel, but they're not reality warpers anymore. The knowledge and technique that made them truly powerful has been lost to time. If the Red Guards still had their Ansei and their Pankratos sword technique, they'd be near the top of this list. But they don't. They're an echo of what they once were. The Bosmer live in Valenwood, and they're the smallest of the elven races. They're known for being excellent archers, thieves, and scouts. They're quick, they're agile, and they can practically disappear into the forests they call home. What makes the Bosmer unique is the Green Pact, an agreement they made with a nature god called V, Frey. V taught the Bosmer how to shape themselves and gave form to the chaos of the early world. In exchange, the Bosmer swore to never harm the plant life of Valenwood. They can't cut down trees, pick flowers, or even eat vegetables if they're following the pact properly. This makes them strict carnivores. They eat meat exclusively. And when I say exclusively, I mean they take it to extremes. When Bosmer go to war, they practice ritual cannibalism. After a battle, they're obligated to consume the bodies of their fallen enemies within 3 days. It's a way of honoring both the Green Pact and their victory. The Bosmer can also shapeshift. They can command animals. They're in tune with nature in a way that goes beyond druidic magic. They're connected to the fundamental forces that shaped Valenwood. And then there's the Wild Hunt. This is the Bosmer's ultimate weapon, and it's absolutely terrifying. When Valenwood is threatened, when there's no other option, the Bosmer can call a Wild Hunt. They transform into savage, shape-shifting monsters that devour everything in their path. They lose all control, all reason, and become a tide of teeth and claws and hunger that doesn't stop until the threat is eliminated. The Wild Hunt has been used in Valenwood's history to devastating effect. Entire armies have been destroyed by it. It leaves nothing but bones. Once it starts, there's no stopping it until the danger has passed. Some Bosmer who participate in the hunt never fully return to their normal forms. But here's the problem. The Wild Hunt is a last resort. It's unpredictable, uncontrollable, and dangerous to everyone involved. The Bosmer can't just deploy it whenever they want. It requires specific rituals and conditions. And outside of the Wild Hunt, the Bosmer are skilled archers and scouts, but that's about it. They're excellent at what they do. Their connection to Ifre and their ability to transform is unique among the races. but they haven't done anything that reshaped the world or pushed the boundaries of power. They're survivors who've adapted perfectly to their environment, but that's different from the kind of raw power we're looking for. The orcs have one of the weirdest origin stories in all of Tamriel. They used to be elves. Specifically, they were followers of a god named Trinimac, who was one of the most powerful Aedra. Trinimac was a warrior deity, strong and honorable, and his followers were the same. Then Boethia, a Daedric prince, decided to prove a point about the weakness of the Aedra. Boethia consumed Trinimac, corrupted him from within, and when Boethia excreted him out, Trinimac had become Malakath. All of Trinimac's followers were transformed along with their god. They became the Orsimer, the pariah folk, the orcs. Orcs are incredibly strong. They're the best heavy warriors in Tamriel, capable of taking and dealing massive amounts of damage. They have a racial ability called Berserker Rage, where they essentially become unstoppable for a short time. They're also skilled craftsmen, and orc armor and weapons are highly prized across Tamriel. Orc society is organized around strongholds led by chieftains. The chieftain is always the strongest warrior. If you want to be chief, you challenge the current chief and beat him in single combat. It's a meritocracy based entirely on strength. They follow a strict code of honor based around Malakath's teachings. But here's the thing about orcs. They're straightforward. They're strong, they're tough, they're excellent at what they do. But they're not doing anything that goes beyond physical prowess. They don't have reality warping magic. They don't have ancient hive minds or technological wonders. They're warriors, and while they're the best at being warriors, that's where it ends. They've been discriminated against and pushed to the margins of Tamriel for their entire existence. They've never built a great empire or discovered some secret that changed the world. They're survivors who've carved out a place for themselves through sheer strength and determination. Orcs are powerful individuals, but as a race, they haven't demonstrated anything that puts them above the others on this list. The Khajiit are the cat people from elsewhere, and they're way weirder than most people realize. The Khajiit aren't just one thing. They're tied to the moons of Nirn, Masr, and Secunda, and the phase of the moons when a Khajiit is born determines what form they take. There are like 16 different forms of Khajiit. Some are Alfiq, which look like regular house cats but are fully intelligent and can cast magic. Some are Ohms, who look almost exactly like Bosmer with some feline features. The Katay are what you see in most games, the classic humanoid cat people. Then you have Sincherat, which are as big as mammoths and are used as cavalry mounts. And that's just scratching the surface. This moon connection is unique in Tamriel. No other race has their physical form determined by celestial bodies. The Khajiit worship the moons and see them as the bodies of divine beings. Their entire culture revolves around this cosmic connection. The Khajiit are also known for being excellent thieves, traders, and scouts. They're naturally agile, they can see in the dark, and their claws make them dangerous even unarmed. They run the skooma trade, which is basically magical drugs through criminal organizations that span all of Tamriel. They are survivors who've turned their desert homeland into a thriving nation. But in terms of raw power, the Khajiit haven't really demonstrated anything massive. They have their moon connection, which is cool and unique, but they're not out here warping reality or conquering continents. They're traders and survivors, excellent at adapting to whatever situation they find themselves in. The Khajiit are successful because they're flexible and clever, but that's different from the kind of power that reshapes the world. Now we're getting into the really interesting stuff. Most people think of Argonians as kind of a joke race. They're the lizard people from Black Marsh, and yeah, they've been enslaved by the Dunmer for thousands of years. They live in swamps, they're not particularly advanced technologically, and they don't seem very impressive at first glance. But that completely misses what makes them absolutely terrifying. Argonians aren't just lizard people, they're biologically linked to something called the Hist. The Hist are these ancient, sentient trees that grow in Black Marsh. And when I say ancient, I mean they might predate most life on Nirn. They might have been around since before the current Kalpa, the current cycle of creation. When Argonian eggs are laid, they're placed in hatching pools near Hist trees. The eggs drink the sap from the hist roots, and that's what gives them intelligence and their humanoid form. Without the hist, Argonians revert to basically being animals. The connection between Argonians and the hist is that deep. The hist are connected in a hive mind. They can communicate with every Argonian who's ever tasted their sap, no matter where they are in Tamriel. They can recall Argonians from across the continent. They can give them visions, guide them, direct them. When an Argonian dies, their soul returns to the hist, and their memories are absorbed. The hist maintain a biological database of every Argonian who has ever lived. But it gets way better. The hist can modify Argonians. They can alter their biology, make them bigger, stronger, faster, more adapted to whatever situation requires it. They can change Argonians at will. And we saw exactly what that means during the Oblivion Crisis. When Mehrunes Dagon opened his Oblivion gates across Tamriel, most provinces were barely holding on. Cities were falling. People were dying by the thousands. The Empire was scrambling to mount any kind of defense. In Cyrodiil, Martin Septim had to sacrifice himself to end the invasion. In Morrowind, they lost entire regions to the Daedra. In Skyrim, the Nords fought desperately to defend their holds. But in Blackmarsh, something completely different happened. The hist saw it coming. They predicted the Oblivion Crisis before it started. They called the Argonians home, back to Blackmarsh, and then they changed them. They turned the Argonians into super soldiers specifically designed to fight Daedra. When the Oblivion Gates opened in Blackmarsh, the Argonians didn't defend, they attacked. They poured through the gates into Oblivion itself. They went into the Deadlands, Mehrunes, Dagon's home realm, and started wrecking everything so badly that the Daedra couldn't handle it. Mehrunes Dagon's lieutenants actually closed the gates themselves to stop being invaded. The Daedra, immortal beings from Oblivion who thrive on destruction and warfare, were so overwhelmed by the modified Argonians that they shut their own invasion portals. Let that sink in. Every other race in Tamriel was desperately trying to survive. The Argonians were winning so hard that they became the aggressors. They invaded Hell and the demons had to retreat. This didn't happen anywhere else. Not in Cyrodiil, not in Skyrim, not in Hammerfell, nowhere. The Argonians were the only race that turned the Oblivion Crisis into an offensive campaign. They didn't just defend their homeland, they counterattacked into another dimension and forced the enemy to withdraw. And after the crisis ended, after the gates closed, the Argonians didn't stop. The hist kept them mobilized. 5 years later, Red Mountain erupted and devastated Morrowind. The Dunmer, who had been enslaving Argonians for thousands of years, were crippled. Their tribunal gods were gone, their homeland was destroyed, they were vulnerable. The Argonians, led by a political group called the Engelil, invaded. They sacked Mournhold, the capital of Morrowind. They pushed as far north as Vardenfell. They conquered huge portions of southern Morrowind. House Redoran eventually stopped their advance, but the damage was done. The Argonians claimed massive territories, and some of them still hold it by the Fourth Era. So what does this tell us? The Argonians have an ancient hive mind backing them that can predict future threats, modify their biology to counter those threats, and coordinate an entire race across thousands of miles. When the hist decides to act, the Argonians become something else entirely. They become an army capable of invading Oblivion and winning. The scary part is that they don't even try most of the time. They just want to be left alone in their swamp. But when the hist calls them to war, they become a force that can defeat literal demons in their own realm. That's legitimately terrifying. Now we get into the races that aren't playable. And the Dwemer are probably the most important race in all of Elder Scrolls lore that we never actually see. The Dwemer were called dwarves, but they weren't short. They were elves, they were mer. Giants called them dwarves because they lived underground, and the name stuck. The Dwemer built massive cities in caverns beneath the surface of Tamriel, primarily in Morrowind, Skyrim, and Hammerfell. What made the Dwemer different from every other race in Tamriel is that they didn't worship any gods. None. Not the Nine Divines, not the Daedra, nothing. They looked at the gods and said, "We can do better than you." And then they actually tried to prove it. The Dwemer were technological geniuses. They had steam power, geothermal energy, and mechanical constructs that are still working perfectly in the Fourth Era. Think about that. The Dwemer disappeared in the year 700 of the First Era. By the time Skyrim happens, that's thousands of years later, and their machines still work like they were built yesterday. They built animunculi, these robots that guard their ruins. Dwarven spiders, spheres, centurions. These things are still patrolling ruins, still attacking intruders, still following their original programming after millennia. The craftsmanship is so perfect that they don't break down. They're completely self-maintaining. Nobody in the Fourth Era can replicate this technology. The best blacksmiths in Tamriel can't figure out how to make Dwemer metal. They can melt down existing Dwemer materials and reforge them, but they can't create new Dwemer alloys from scratch. The Dwemer had airships, actual flying machines. They're found in ruins across Skyrim and Morrowind. They built the Oculary, a device that could collect starlight, process it through lenses and crystals, and project it onto maps to find sources of magical power. This wasn't magic in the traditional sense. This was engineering that used magical principles as a power source. They created devices that could read Elder Scrolls without making you go blind or insane. Elder Scrolls are artifacts that contain the fabric of time and fate itself. Reading them normally causes blindness or madness because mortal minds can't process that much information. The Dwemer just built a machine to do it safely. They looked at an impossible problem and engineered a solution. They developed telepathy through technology. They had these helmets called Dwarven miters that allowed mental communication across huge distances. They essentially built a psychic network connecting their entire civilization. This wasn't telepathy like a spell. This was technology that transmitted thoughts. All of this was built on something they called tonal architecture. This is the concept that reality has underlying tones or frequencies, and if you understand those frequencies, you can manipulate them. The Dwemer saw the universe as something that could be measured, understood, and changed through logic and mathematics. They weren't using magic in the way other races used magic. They were manipulating the fundamental laws of physics. Their society was structured around this philosophy. While other civilizations put kings and priests in charge, the Dwemer put engineers and scholars at the top. You became a leader by being the smartest, the most accomplished, not by being born into it or having favor with the gods. Merit ruled everything. They built cities that are still standing. Blackreach is this massive underground cavern with a city built inside it, and it's so huge that it has its own ecosystem. There are glowing mushrooms the size of trees. There are underground rivers and lakes. The Dwemer built an entire functioning city in a space that big, with buildings and bridges and infrastructure that has lasted thousands of years. And then they found the heart of Lorkhan. Deep beneath Red Mountain in Morrowind, Dwemer miners discovered the actual physical heart of a god. Lorkhan is the deity who convinced or tricked other divine beings to create the mortal world. As punishment, the other gods tore his heart out and threw it down to Nirn, where it crashed into the earth and formed Red Mountain. The Dwemer found this heart, still beating after eons, buried in a chamber deep underground. Most civilizations would worship it or be terrified of it. The Dwemer saw a power source. They saw an opportunity to prove their philosophy was right. Enter Kagrenak, their chief tonal architect. He was their head engineer, their greatest mind. Kagrenak looked at the heart of Lorkhan and designed 3 tools to manipulate it. Sunder was a hammer. Keening was a blade. Wraithguard was a gauntlet that protected the wielder from the power of the other 2. Using these tools in the right sequence, with the right tones, you could tap into the divine power of the heart. Kagrenak's plan was to build Numidium, a massive brass construct, a mechanical god. Numidium was supposed to be powered by the heart of Lorkhan, but it was more than just a weapon. Kagrenak wanted to use the heart to elevate the entire Dwemer race to divinity. He wanted to make every single Dwemer immortal, to transform them into something beyond mortal limits. They were going to achieve godhood through technology and engineering, proving once and for all that their logic and reason was superior to divine power. But they were at war with the Chimer. The Chimer, who would later become the Dunmer, saw what the Dwemer were doing with the heart as blasphemy. Indoril Nerevar led the Chimer forces along with his council, which included Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothasil. The Chimer believed the Dwemer were mocking the gods themselves. During the Battle of Red Mountain, in the year 700 of the First Era, everything came to a head. The armies clashed. Nerevar and his forces pushed into the Heart Chamber. And Kagrenac, either by choice or because he was forced to act before he was ready, used his tools on the heart of Lorkhan. And then every single Dwemer on Tamriel vanished, gone, completely, instantly. Not just the ones in Morrowind at Red Mountain. Every Dwemer everywhere. The ones in Skyrim disappeared. The ones who had migrated to Hammerfell generations earlier, they vanished too. All at the exact same moment. There was no trace of them left. Their cities remained intact. Their machines kept running. But every living Dwemer was just gone. The only Dwemer who survived was Yagrum Bagarn, and he only lived because he was exploring an outer realm, another dimension, when it happened. When he came back, his entire race had disappeared. He's the last Dwemer, afflicted with Corpus disease, living in a dungeon in Morrowind, and he has no idea what happened to his people. So, what did happen? That's the question that drives people crazy. Nobody knows for sure. Yagrum Bagarn thinks Kagrenac's spell backfired somehow. Maybe they were all killed instantly. Maybe they were transported to another dimension. Maybe they were scattered across time. Maybe they achieved exactly what they wanted and ascended to a higher plane of existence where mortals can't perceive them. There's a theory that they're all bound to Numidium somehow. Their souls were absorbed into the brass god and they power it from within. This would explain why Numidium is so devastatingly powerful when it appears in later history. Tiber Septim used Numidium to conquer the Somerset Isles in what's called the Warp in the West, and it was basically unstoppable. Another theory is that they achieved something called zero sum. In Elder Scrolls metaphysics, if you achieve enlightenment and realize that you don't actually exist, that you're just a dream of the Godhead, you can cease to exist entirely. Maybe the Dwemer all realized this at once and vanished because they understood they were never real to begin with. There's a quest in Skyrim where a researcher named Arniel Gain tries to recreate what happened. He studies the Dwemer disappearance obsessively. He gets a piece of the warped soul gem that was supposed to be a substitute for the heart of Lorkhan. He uses keening on it, trying to replicate Kagrenac's experiment on a small scale. And when he activates it, he vanishes completely. But his shade can be summoned as a spell, and it wanders around following the player. He's there, but not there, existing in some in-between state. Some people think this is what happened to the Dwemer. They're still around somewhere, just not in a way we can perceive or interact with. But here's what we know for certain. The Dwemer reached so far, pushed so hard against the boundaries of what was possible, that they either destroyed themselves or transformed themselves so completely that they left reality as we know it. That's power, that's ambition on a scale that no other race has ever matched. Every other race in Tamriel still uses some version of what the Dwemer left behind. Their metal is still the best you can find. Their constructs still guard their ruins and kill anyone who gets too close. Their technology is studied by every mage and scholar who wants to understand how the world works. Thousands of years later, nobody has caught up to them. Nobody can do what they did. The Dwemer looked at the gods and said, "We don't need you." Then they tried to become gods themselves. And something happened that was so extreme, so reality-breaking, that an entire civilization vanished in an instant. Whether they succeeded or failed, the fact that they tried and that something that massive happened is proof of their power. The Falmer are a tragedy. They used to be the Snow Elves, and they had a civilization that rivaled the Altmer. They lived on the surface of Skyrim during the Merethic era, before humans arrived. They built cities, they had culture, they had magic, they were sophisticated and powerful. Then the Nords came. The Atmorans, led by Ysgramor, sailed from their frozen homeland to Skyrim. At first there was peace. The Snow Elves allowed the humans to settle, but something went wrong. The Snow Elves attacked the north settlement of Saartal in what's called the Night of Tears. They killed almost everyone. Only Ysgramor and his 2 sons escaped. Why did the Snow Elves attack? There are different theories. Some say the Nords discovered the Eye of Magnus buried beneath Saarthal, and the Snow Elves attacked to claim it. Some say it was just territorial conflict that escalated. Some say the Snow Elves feared what the Nords might become if they were allowed to thrive. Whatever the reason, it was a mistake. Ysgramor returned with an army. The 500 companions, legendary warriors, sailed back to Skyrim and launched a campaign of revenge. They hunted the Snow Elves relentlessly. The return was brutal and one-sided. The Nords had better warriors, better weapons, and they were driven by vengeance. The Snow Elves were driven to near extinction. Their cities were burned. Their people were slaughtered. The survivors fled underground, seeking refuge wherever they could find it. And some of them went to the Dwemer. The Dwemer agreed to take them in. They offered the Snow Elf sanctuary in their underground cities. But there was a price. The Dwemer forced the Snow Elves to eat a toxic fungus that rendered them blind. Then they enslaved them. The Snow Elves became a slave race, working in Dwemer mines and cities, doing the dangerous jobs the Dwemer didn't want to do. Over generations, cut off from sunlight, poisoned by the fungus, enslaved and brutalized, the Snow Elves devolved. They became the twisted creatures known as the Falmer. They're blind, they're savage, they lost their language and culture. They attack anything that enters their territory. They're more like feral animals than the sophisticated civilization they once were. But they're not completely mindless. The Falmer still have some organization. They keep Chorus, these huge insects, as livestock and war beasts. They build their own primitive structures in the ruins they inhabit. They craft weapons and armor. Some intelligence remains, but it's buried under generations of trauma and mutation. Eventually, the Falmer rebelled against the Dwemer. The War of the Crag was this massive underground conflict that raged for decades. The Falmer fought with desperation and numbers. The Dwemer fought with technology and discipline. It's unclear who was winning when the Dwemer disappeared, but with their masters gone, the Falmer inherited the ruins. By the 4th era, the Falmer are just another monster in the dungeons. They're dangerous, sure. They're aggressive and they know their territory. But they're not powerful in any meaningful sense. They're victims of one of the most horrific betrayals in Tamriel's history. There's only one pure Snow Elf left. Knight Paladin Jelibor and his brother Archcurate Verther survived by serving Auriel in the Chantry of Auriel, which was isolated from the rest of Skyrim. Verther eventually became a vampire and went insane. Gelibor remains alone, the last witness to what his people once were. So, the Falmer are a cautionary tale. They were powerful once, but they were destroyed by the Nords and betrayed by the Dwemer. Now, they're barely more than monsters. They're not a candidate for most powerful race. They're an example of how completely a civilization can fall. And now, we get to the Slode. These guys are probably the most hated and feared race in all of Tamriel, and for very good reason. The Slode are slug-like creatures from the archipelago of Thras in the Abyssian Sea, southwest of Tamriel. They're huge, amphibious, and they're masters of necromancy. The Slode don't just use necromancy, they've built their entire civilization around it. They reanimate corpses to use as slaves. They slaughter sea creatures and bring them back to serve as guardians and workers. They buy slaves from pirates specifically to kill them and use them as undead labor. Everything in Slode culture revolves around death and undeath. Slode society is organized around the Coral Kingdoms, these partially submerged cities built from coral and bone. They're amphibious, so their cities are half underwater. The Slode themselves are incredibly long-lived. They can live for centuries, and as they age, they grow larger. The oldest and largest Slode are the rulers, these massive slug-like beings that have accumulated centuries of magical knowledge. The Slode don't worship gods in any traditional sense, but they'll make sacrifices to Daedric princes when they want something. They're completely pragmatic about it. They see the Daedra as powerful beings who can be bargained with, not as divine figures to be revered. Sloth physiology is really weird. When they're young, they're small and relatively mobile. As they age, they grow larger and heavier. The oldest sloth are so massive that they can barely move on land. They're too heavy to support their own weight outside of water, so they use teleportation magic to get around. They just teleport from place to place rather than walking. But here's what makes the S-Sloth absolutely terrifying. They created the Thracian Plague, the single deadliest disease in Tamriel's history. This plague killed half the population of the entire continent. Half. Let that sink in. Millions of people died. Entire cities were depopulated. Provinces were crippled. Valenwood lost so many people that they couldn't resist when Cyrodiil invaded later. Elsewhere was devastated. The Thracian Plague wasn't an accident. The Sloth created it deliberately. Some sources say it was an act of war. Others say it was an experiment that got out of control. Either way, the Sloth unleashed a disease that came closer to wiping out civilization in Tamriel than any war or invasion. The response was immediate and massive. The All Flags Navy was assembled, a combined fleet from almost every race and nation in Tamriel. Humans, elves, everyone who could sail came together for one purpose. They sailed to Thras, and they somehow sank the entire archipelago using unknown magic. The coral kingdoms were dragged down into the ocean. The Sloth were nearly wiped out. But it didn't last. The Sloth brought their islands back up from the ocean floor. They rebuilt. By the time of the games, Thras is back, and the Sloth are still there, still practicing their necromancy, still isolated from the rest of Tamriel. The Sloth also command sea monsters. They have power over marine life in ways that other races don't understand. They can control giant sea serpents, direct swarms of smaller creatures, and generally make the oceans around their territory extremely dangerous. There's also a variant called the Sea Sloth, who are even more powerful and mysterious. The Sea Sloth live in deep underwater kingdoms and rarely interact with surface dwellers. They're skilled in necromancy like regular Sloth, but they've also mastered shadow magic, mind control, and alchemy. They can create shadow slave clones of people. They command creatures from the deep ocean like the Yahara, these horrible crab-like monsters. The Sea Sloth are more reclusive than their surface cousins, and we know almost nothing about what they're truly capable of. So, the Sloth created a plague that killed half of Tamriel. They survived having their entire homeland sunk into the ocean and brought it back. They command sea monsters and have mastered necromancy to a degree that other races find horrifying. They're persistent, they're dangerous, and they're still out there. The reason the Sloth aren't more active in Tamriel's affairs is that everyone hates them. Every race agrees that the Sloth are a threat. If the Sloth started causing problems again, another All Flags Navy would probably form to deal with them. So they mostly stay in Thras, doing whatever horrible things they do, and only occasionally interfering with the surface world. Alright, we've gone through every major race in Tamriel. Now let's actually answer the question. Which race is the most powerful? If we're talking about pure technological and magical achievement, the answer is clearly the Dwemer. Nobody else comes close. They built machines that still work perfectly thousands of years after they disappeared. They mastered tonal architecture and could manipulate the fundamental frequencies of reality. They created airships, telepathic networks, and devices that could safely read Elder Scrolls. They looked at the gods and decided they could do better. The Dwemer's attempt to achieve godhood was so ambitious and so extreme that it either succeeded in a way we can't comprehend or failed so catastrophically that it erased them from reality. Either way, that's power on a scale nobody else has matched. They didn't just push the boundaries of what was possible, they tried to completely rewrite those boundaries. The fact that their technology still can't be replicated in the Fourth Era is proof of how far ahead they were. The best blacksmiths in Skyrim can't figure out how to make Dwemer metal. The most learned mages can't understand how their constructs work. Thousands of years of study, and nobody has caught up to them. That's dominance. The Dwemer are the historical peak. They're the race that went the furthest, reached the highest, and did things that still define the world thousands of years later. But if we're talking about a race that's still around, still dangerous, still capable of massive displays of power, the answer is the Argonians, with the Hist backing them. The Argonians invaded Oblivion and won. Let me say that again because it's so insane it bears repeating. When Mehrunes Dagon opened gates to his realm of Oblivion across all of Tamriel, when demons poured through and cities burned, when the Empire was scrambling to survive, the Argonians went on the offensive. They poured into the Deadlands and fought so hard that the Daedra closed their own gates to stop being invaded. That didn't happen anywhere else. No other race turned the Oblivion Crisis into an offensive campaign. The Argonians did it because the Hist saw it coming, modified them biologically to fight Daedra, and coordinated the entire race into a devastating counterattack. The Hist are ancient. They might predate most life on Nirn. They can predict future threats. They can modify Argonians at will. They maintain a hive mind that connects every Argonian who's ever tasted their sap. When an Argonian dies, their memories return to the Hist. That means the Hist have access to thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and experience. And the scary thing is, we don't know what the Hist wants. We don't know what they're planning. They predicted the Oblivion Crisis. What else can they see? What other threats are they preparing for? The Argonians invaded Morrowind after the Red Year and conquered huge territories. Was that revenge for slavery? Was that the Hist expanding its territory? We don't know. The Argonians are the sleeping giant. Most of the time, they just want to be left alone in Black Marsh. But when the Hist calls them to war, they become something terrifying. They become an army that can invade hell and win. The Slowed deserve mention too. They created a plague that killed half of Tamriel. They're master necromancers who've been terrorizing the world since ancient times. They survived having their entire homeland destroyed and brought it back. They're persistent and dangerous. But the Slowed are limited. They're stuck in Thras because everyone hates them. If they tried to invade Tamriel directly, every race would unite against them again. Their power is real, but it's constrained by the fact that they're universally reviled. The Altmer are politically powerful and magically gifted, but they haven't done anything on the scale of the Dwemer or Argonians. They lost the Crystal Tower. They're strong, but not reality-breaking. The Nords produce Dragonborn, who are individually incredibly powerful. But as a race, without that divine blessing, they're just really good warriors. The Tuom is rare and takes decades to learn. The Red Guards had sword singers who could supposedly cut atoms and sink continents, but that art has been lost. By the 4th era, they're just really good fighters. They're an echo of what they once were. The Dunmer had the Tribunal, but the Tribunal was running on stolen power that eventually ran out. The Bosmer have the Wild Hunt, which is devastating but uncontrollable. The Orcs are strong but straightforward. The Imperials are great organizers, but not reality warpers. The Bretons, Khajiit, everyone else has their strengths, but they haven't demonstrated power on the scale we're talking about. So here's my final answer. The most powerful race in Elder Scrolls history is the Dwemer. They achieved things that still can't be explained or replicated. They tried to become gods through technology and engineering. Whether they succeeded or failed, the scale of their ambition and the evidence of their achievement puts them at the top. But the most dangerous race currently in Tamriel is the Argonians with the Hist. They have an ancient hive mind that can see the future, modify their biology, and coordinate them into an unstoppable force when necessary. They proved during the Oblivion Crisis that they can fight Daedra in Oblivion itself and win. They're still here, still connected to the Hist, still capable of doing it again. The Dwemer are the peak of what's possible. The Argonians are the sleeping giant that everyone forgets about until it's too late. Both have done things that seem impossible. Both have changed Tamriel in ways that no other race has matched. If I have to choose one, I'm going with the Dwemer. They pushed reality further than anyone else. They built wonders that last forever. They tried to achieve divinity, and something so extreme happened that it's still a mystery. That's real power. That's the kind of achievement that puts a race at the top of the list. But don't sleep on the Argonians. They're the only race that invaded another realm and won. And unlike the Dwemer, they're still around. They're still dangerous. The Hist is still out there, planning something we don't understand. Those are the two most powerful races in the Elder Scrolls. The Dwemer for what they achieved, the Argonians for what they're still capable of achieving. Everything else falls somewhere below them. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you agree? Do you think I'm completely wrong? Is there something I missed that changes the ranking? I read every comment, so let me know your thoughts. And if you learned something new about Elder Scrolls lore today, if this deep dive into the races was interesting, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to explore in this universe, and I've got plenty more videos coming. Thanks for watching.